In today's video, I'm going to be discussing whether Secrets of Strixhaven is a good draft format. Now, good is a very subjective metric, but I'm going to be approaching this topic from several different angles so you can get a more complete perspective of how the format has played out and whether it would be a good format for you, regardless of whether I personally find it to be a good format, though I will, of course, be sharing my own personal opinion. So, the first metric I want to talk about is balance, because I think that having a balanced format is really important for making the format good, because being balanced leads to good things like replayability, fun gameplay where you play a variety of matchups, and being just like the things of that nature, where if you have an imbalanced format, the draft portion becomes a lot more trappy, where people that know the balance can like exploit it, where like, oh, blue-black is unplayable in this format, so nobody drafts blue-black if they know what's going on. And then the new player that shows up to the draft pod drafts blue-black because it's wide open. They're drafting like good for their seat, and then they get crushed because blue-black is bad. And I think that leads to weak formats. And also, if everyone does know what's going on, then you just end up in this situation where you're all fighting over archetypes. Every deck is less powerful, less interesting, and you're kind of scrapping it out with these archetypes where it feels like, okay, well, I happened to open a really good card for the archetype, you didn't, so my version is just better than yours because we both had to draft the archetype because nobody could draft blue-black or whatever it is, things of that nature. And so I think that the fact that the format is balanced is really, really nice. There are aggressive decks in the format. There's the white-black aggressive deck. There's the red-white deck, which actually got there on its theme this time, which I think is absolutely huge. The red-white theme, of course, being things leaving the graveyard, which red-white doesn't normally do, but it's been a very effective deck in this format. They learned their lesson from the first Strixhaven, where it was a bit of a miss. And the fact that that is a good deck in this format not only means that you get to draft this cool red-white archetype that you don't get to draft in other formats, but also that you get to have that deck be an effective deck in the first place. And it's not only a cool deck, but also a good deck. And so you have like the black-white aggro deck, the red-white deck, the multicolor control decks based around blue-red or blue-green in many cases, and then not white-black, black-green being kind of in last place, but also still very draftable. You can still do some really scary things with the deck. And as the format has progressed, people have realized that black-green is a little bit weaker. They've also understood that it needs to be kind of built as an aggressive strategy. And as a result, it's been less drafted, which means when you do draft it, you end up feeling like you're getting rewarded with good cards and can have a pretty strong version. And so I feel like all of the archetypes being playable has been really good from a balance perspective and overall from a gameplay perspective as well. I've been drafting this format a ton. And before I get to the next point, I do want to say that I am hosting a coaching session. So if you've been struggling in the format, maybe you don't understand how to draft all the archetypes, I am doing a coaching session on Sunday, May 17th, where I'm going to be doing an hour of draft prep and then bonus 30 minutes of Q&A at the end, of course, answering questions throughout. But if you're interested in getting some more insights into the format on how to win, then doing the coaching can be a really nice additional way to get some improvement in where you can talk with me more directly and get some insights. Anyway, getting back to the topics, as I was talking about the archetypes being balanced, I also want to say that I think that the archetypes being balanced also leads to replayability, where when you play the format, you play a variety of different decks and you play a variety of different matchups, where you're not just like only playing the same decks over and over. That is definitely a weakness, especially in a 5 archetype format. That can be a really big weakness where you have only 5 decks, and so you need all of them to work so you can play the variety of matchups. You need to be able to be like, okay, if I'm playing my red-white deck, I'm going to play against 4 different decks or 5 different decks when I queue up, versus, okay, well, I'm playing my red-white deck. There's only 3 supported archetypes in the set because the other ones just kind of missed. And so when I play red-white, I'm either playing the mirror match, I'm playing against black-white, or I'm playing against blue-red, or something like that. Where if you miss and the color is really bad, or you miss and an archetype is really bad, it can make the replayability feel a lot worse. But this set feels quite replayable because it feels like the archetypes got there. It also feels like the set has shifted over time, where early on in the format, people kind of came in thinking, okay, red-white was bad the first time, so it'll be bad this time. So you could get really good red-white decks because people were avoiding the archetype. People didn't understand how good the multicolor payoff cards would be, so you could get these really good like multicolored control decks at the beginning of the format. And then people started to figure it out. And so you had to adjust if you wanted to keep winning. You had to be like, okay, I need to start drafting these multicolored control decks less because I'm not going to be getting the fixing very, very late in packs. I need to draft red-white a little bit less because I'm not going to be wheeling all of these red-white cards that are really, really good, because now people know that they're good. And so that has led to some nice replayability as well, where drafting the format week 1 feels very distinct from drafting the format later on, like now when I'm drafting the format. And I think that's been pretty nice as well. I think that there is one miss as far as archetypes are concerned, and that's the blue-red tempo deck. And so I think that deck hasn't really kind of come to the forefront. It hasn't really been as well supported, but I think that's less of a big deal because the blue-red control deck is still supported, so you can still draft blue-red effectively. And even though there's a couple of cards that maybe go down in value, there's not so many of them that it feels like the deck doesn't work. And so from a balance perspective, from playing the archetypes perspective, it doesn't feel like there's any like giant misses that are going to really impact the format or like kind of ruin the experience for a new person who's new to the format sitting down for the first time. Though of course it is very skill testing as a format, so sitting down for the first time, you're not going to be as effective drafting it as someone that's drafted it 15 times, 20 times, even more. And so that's also kind of a nice aspect of the format, where being skill testing, being rewarding of skill is a really good aspect of these formats, where it feels like understanding which cards go into which decks is a relatively like complex thought process. It takes a little bit of time to understand. You have to kind of play with the cards and see them in action before you're like, okay, this black card is really good in black white. It's not as good in black green. So if I am drafting and I have 2 copies of this black card, I'm going to try to put it into a black white deck instead of just a black, like any black deck in general. And I'm going to try to shift my draft in that direction to kind of navigate those waters. And I think that's a really nice aspect of the format as well. Also understanding which cards are flexible early picks that can go into multiple decks, where you think, okay, well, this card is technically only going to be good in multicolored control decks, but that multicolored control deck could be base blue-green or base blue-red, and so it is kind of a flexible card still. Whereas when you see another card, you can be like, okay, well, this is a really strong blue card that only goes into my blue-green decks. And so when you kind of understand that, that can also be a pretty like nice level up moment in the format. And so from the perspective of balance, from the perspective of replayability, from the perspective of being kind of like skill testing, I think the format kind of hits all of those metrics. I think this is a good format. 5 archetype sets kind of have a high bar for me to clear because they can often suffer in all of those metrics when you don't get the benefits of having 10 different archetypes to master, 10 different archetypes to play, to understand. But I think this set actually like kind of knocked it out of the park as far as a 5 archetype set is concerned, because all of the archetypes have felt pretty deep. The format has felt like it's developed over time. And overall, I think it is a very fun gameplay experience and one that I would recommend to others. So I think as far as my overall grade, I don't really give like numeric grades or letter grades on the format, but I think this is a good format. It's one that if you do enjoy draft, you will probably enjoy this format. It's one that rewards you for like spending some time drafting it, but it's also just kind of fun to play the first couple times you draft it as well, because the archetypes are pretty unique, pretty fun. Black-white being the most aggressive deck in a format doesn't happen all that often. Red-white being a leaves the graveyard deck, as I mentioned, doesn't happen all that often. Blue-green being a multicolored control deck definitely happens. Blue-red being kind of a control deck does happen. Black-green being kind of an aggressive deck. I don't know why I always say white for the black-green deck, but the black-green deck being kind of an aggressive shell instead of a more mid-rangey or late-game shell doesn't happen all that often. So there's a lot of unique archetypes running around. The mechanics, a lot of them don't require that much of you. I mean, the red-white deck wants you to have a good mix of cards that care about leaving the graveyard and leaving the graveyard. So that's like a deck archetype thing. But the mechanic itself is being like flashback spells, just a kind of a good mechanic. The blue-red mechanic rewarding you for casting instants and sorceries and rewarding you especially for casting big ones sometimes can lead to more interesting gameplay as a result, where you're like, okay, I want to play more expensive instants and sorceries. But generally, it just kind of happens. The black-green deck being a life gain deck, that kind of is kind of a nice one to try to build around. And then like the black-white deck having some stuff that cares about targeting things is just kind of like leads to some interesting gameplay decisions versus being like a really complex mechanic that kind of like punishes you for like playing badly. And then increment is like a blue-green mechanic that cares about casting more and more expensive spells. It hasn't been like a game-breaking mechanic, but these sort of kind of passive mechanics can lead to like some nice avenues where you kind of like knowing like, okay, I want to play these cards in a certain way. They tend to be more gameplay based than like, okay, I need to like build my deck completely around this mechanic. And I think that has been interesting as well. Overall, great grade for Secrets of Strixhaven. I hope you enjoyed hearing my perspective, and I hope you've enjoyed the format yourself if you have been playing it. And if you haven't played it, maybe give it a shot, because I think it might overperform your expectations if you are thinking about these 5 archetype sets and maybe ones that you haven't enjoyed in the past. This one's quite good and one that I think you will enjoy. That's going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.